is Behind the Games from newoverlords.com, where we seek creators of all kinds to find out what's behind our favorite games. With your hosts, Jeff and Seema.
This is Behind the Games, and from our Midwest studio, I'm Jeff Illimek.
And from our Northeast studio, I'm Seema.
Back when I was a developer and a project manager for big software projects, a key to success I learned was you never ask the developer if the software is done or how done it is. Because developers exist in this heady state of flow where creation is happening and they're notoriously bad at that moment, in the moment, and seeing the big picture. If you want to know if it's done, you ask QA. So to help us shine some light on what's really going on in QA and game testing in general, we are joined today by Jonah Davidson, a QA engineer. Jonah, hello.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So three other sort of like intro ideas I want to just throw out there to set the stage, and then we'll ask you for your introduction. I'm sure get your view on it too, but in my view, I think a couple misconceptions that people have about QA, and then there's probably more about game testing in general, but QA of any software is a very technical role. Most QA leads, most QA engineers are great devs. Done, what QA is testing is not if it compiles, it's not if it works, but it's done when it matches what it's supposed to do. And that's why you don't ask the developer who dumped their brain into some magical piece of code that does some brilliant thing and compiles and it's bug-free and perfect, but it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't match the spec. It's not done. And then the last thing, which I know we'll get into in quite a bit of detail, is testing and QA, and what a test is and what game testing is not one thing. You don't just go in and play a game and write down what you see. There's layers and layers and tests and each different stage and each different point of each different step in the process has many different things going on that QA is responsible for. So with all of that as sort of the backdrop, as people have that in their minds, let's get to you, Jonah, and let you introduce yourself, where you're at right now, and then we'll start breaking apart that, what does your day in the life look like, and what can you teach us about QA?
Sounds good. My name, as I said, Jonah Davidson. I am a QA engineer technician. I'm not entirely sure what the right word is, at Finji, which is a collaborative game studio based out of Michigan. I'm actually based out of Ontario, Canada, and working remote. And I spend most of my days testing games. I've had 2 published projects already, and I'm working on my 3rd as a QA lead this time.
And what were those projects? Because I think we'll show them off here, because I know they're very cool.
Yeah. The first one was Chicory, A Colorful Tale, which is a sort of Link's Awakening-esque little exploration and story game about a coloring book world that you have to paint back in after all the colors are drained from the world, with an excellent team behind it and amazing music by the composer who also did the soundtrack for Celeste. So that was a joy to listen to as I worked. Following that was Tunic, which recently came out on Game Pass to great acclaim. Another Zelda-like game about a little fox exploring a big mysterious world and attempting to play a game that doesn't necessarily want to be played and asks you to decipher the mysteries without much help.
Yeah, Tunic is getting a lot of acclaim and is very cool. I really like Tunic and the look of it. Chicory is pretty amazing. Chicory is a different twist. I like finding these games that try something different, that go off in a different direction. That's not your traditional way to even think about what a game is or how a game is played. So Chicory, I encourage people to sort of look up Chicory and play it, or at least look up the videos and see what's going on there. Those ideas, I think, are really inspirational for anybody in thinking about what video games is and how they work. And if anyone is thinking about making games, you can really get inspired on different twists of things to do. So yeah, those are both very cool. So I did do work back in the day myself on software development, and I was a developer. I was a project manager, program manager, and I was responsible for testing in a couple big projects. The biggest experience I had with testing everything from usability testing to to integration testing and daily testing was this product. So this is from 1993 through 5. We developed this. This is for United Airlines. It's called United Connection, and it was a desktop product you installed off the disks in here to make reservations. And it connected up to their mainframe. It dialed a number to their mainframe through like CompuServe lines and did hotel, rental car, and airline reservations. And that was about a year or two before all reservations went to the internet, and no one ever used this again.
Yeah, that's a substantial undertaking for that time.
Yeah. Oh, it was. This was great. It took us about a year and a half to get the first version out, and then it was sent out to every Mileage Plus member. It was used. It was very cool that we had online reservations, and it was graphical, and we had a user interface. When we were doing all of the project management, program management, I was one of the leads on the project. This is one of the places where I put all of my learning and experience of what QA really is in place, and all of the stages along the way. Everything from early design and concepts of what we're putting the project together. We had the QA leads in the room, part of the team, day one. The envisioning, the development of the specification, the design, user interface design. We did 8 stages of different kinds of testing for user experience design. I know it works different everywhere. I'm sure you worked in all of those places.
Well, I want to give, but Jonah, before you say your bit, I want to give the other side of what Jeff just said. It's like, as a person who plays games, and a lot of people who one day may be listening to this may have done some testing on games because they were part of a beta test or an alpha test or whatever. And so their idea and my idea of testing might be you play the game, and if you happen to notice something that you didn't like, perhaps, or that was misspelled, you report it. That's easy. That's an easy job.
Yeah.
So,
and it's just playing games all day. QA is just playing games all day, right?
Yeah. So enlighten us.
Yeah. So day to day, honestly, I work at a smaller company. Working at larger companies, you might have more elaborate structures, test plans. But at both big and small companies, you have QA in the room at the start, or hopefully you have QA in the room from the start if you want things to run smoothly. And at a smaller company, my day-to-day might kind of look like just playing games. But a lot of what I'm doing is thinking about the game on as many different levels as I can, whether that's interaction right down to the controls, how they feel, how someone might perceive them, issues someone might run into them, or things just like what happens if you push all the buttons at once is a common problem that most games don't account for.
Yeah.
All the way up to user experience and usability. Are people going to understand this? Is there a way that they can accidentally break the progression or ruin their saves or ruin the experience for themselves inadvertently? And they don't know. Like, they couldn't know that they may not even know that they've hit a bug. And beta testers and having beta testing is super common now. Open betas or closed betas with supporters, Kickstarters, and stuff like that is very common now. But QA, I guess, on top of that is sort of like a final pass, because we have to take in all of the things that all those people might have missed based on all of our knowledge of things that people don't think about, things that people don't notice because they're the absence of something. They are minor usability issues that will grow to be major ones. And so while I am spending a lot of my time just playing the games over and over again, I'm also deliberately trying to break them. I'm trying to go out of my way. I'm playing in unusual ways. I am spending hours just trying to break menus. And I am thinking about what the audience is going to do deliberately and what they're going to do accidentally, and try to make it a more fun and solid experience for them when they finally get their hands on it.
That's interesting that you say deliberately. I mean, do people deliberately try to break things?
People absolutely do. And there's well-meaning people who do. There are speedrunners, there are streamers, there are people who have just a tendency to do that kind of thing. I'm actually the kind of person who does that kind of thing. So it serves me well in this particular job. And then there are the people who do it inadvertently, and it's almost never malicious. It's always out of curiosity. It's like, can I do this? I've noticed that the game kind of lets me wiggle into here. What happens if I keep going? Oh no, I have permanently ruined my save and I have to start over. Like, that's the kind of situation that we desperately want to avoid. So on the base level, I'm just sort of trying to anticipate a lot of those possibilities, trying to test every possible case that someone could get themselves stuck in or run into. And also checking just a lot of little boxes that have to be checked, that someone has to do.
Yeah,
like,
right.
I don't speak 12 languages, but Tunic was localized into 12 plus languages, I think. And someone had to go through and check that all those languages were appearing properly. Not that they were translated correctly, I can't do that. But some languages have different characters. Some languages are right to left or have strings that look different or are longer than the text boxes. Like, those are things you have to account for.
Yeah.
When you are localizing a game. So as QA, I'm the first person who can dig into that and go immediately before anything else happens. There's a string missing here. This menu option doesn't have any text on it. This stretches outside the box and kind of breaks the game visually. And that's not going to ruin anybody's experience. But it's not great, you know?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That matches what my expectations were. There's the playing of the game, and yeah, we get that as being early access and beta testers ourselves, and that's really fun. And in fact, a lot of people, when they're playing the game, are almost expecting a finished product, and they're playing it to just sort of have fun and see if they have fun, you know, and less of the mechanical aspects.
Yeah.
The core job of QA, there are aspects of it, as you're describing, that are very mechanical. You know, it's not just, you know, check the menus. It's check every single menu in every single situation in every single language, and make sure that as you click all of the options in every single menu item, it's very mechanical. It's going through all of those things.
Yeah. And we have to revisit those things periodically whenever there are substantial updates. We have to be able to shed our assumptions about what's already been fixed and start fresh and try to imagine it from the perspective of a new player who just bought the game. They don't know how many iterations there have been. They don't know how many bugs we fixed. They only know the ones that they run into, which is totally fair.
Yeah.
A beta tester who signs up to be a beta tester as part of, you know, open development or something, that's great. That's very helpful and supportive. But our best testing comes from day one, when the game is released to 10,000 people and they all immediately crash into it in wild ways we never would have thought of. But they aren't testers, and they shouldn't have to be testers. It's very kind of them when they send us support emails and we can help them out and they inform us about bugs that need fixing. But it really isn't up to them to do that, and we can't expect them to do that. So it's up to us to try to sort of head off as many of those things as we can. And a good example of that I like to joke about with Tunic,
No, go ahead.
Is that every now and then in Tunic, sometimes players will fall out of the world because they manage to just clip through something. 3D collisions are actually really complicated to program. But I like to think they didn't fall out of the world the few thousand times that I did. I found all the other ways that they could fall out of the world. They found the one or two that we left over, but I found the few thousand other, and those got fixed. So
yeah,
that's about the best we can do. Eventually, it does have to get out the door. So
you've described some of the checklists, the mechanical things. Does the UI work? Does the interface work? Do the controls work? Then there's the gameplay, which you've described. Can the players play the game? Can they get themselves into some weird situation where they can't continue the next quest, or they lost some inventory item that's really important? There's that kind of thing. Way before even that, I know there's just the, as you have multiple developers working on a project, there's unit testing and integration testing. So unit testing, for anybody that's not familiar, is I developed a tool or a system that, you know, does one thing. It's a piece of code that manages the inventory and writes the inventory to the disk when you save the game and brings the inventory back when you open the game. You could test that way down the road at the time of gameplay. But you can also test it with a unit test, and that's much more effective. The earlier you test things, the better, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of commercial, or I should not commercial, a lot of AAA larger scale QA is closer to that vein, where it's, as I said, it's more structured because it's, here are the changes that have been made today, and here are the results of unit tests that we automatically did, things that we automatically checked against. We need you to verify that these like errors that we found are extant, are there in the product so that we can fix them, or they aren't false positives, or they aren't some kind of other quirk. And we do a certain... Yeah, exactly. Or the test is broken, which does happen a surprising amount of the time because it, like the game, is only as well structured as the person who made it was feeling that day. Not even that they wanted to make something poor, but missing a semicolon can break a game.
Well,
so
depending on the language, it can break the build.
Exactly. Yeah. So in a smaller studio like Finji, we do a more maybe informal version of that. But I've been involved in these projects from at least partway through development. A lot of the basic development and structure was already done by the time I joined up with the projects. But we were there while they were iterating on later areas or finalizing certain details. And we were able to offer feedback or find things that could be fixed then so they didn't have to be fixed later, especially after the customers had run into them. Yeah. So there is a certain amount of that structured testing that we do, but it is less formal, I would say, more ad hoc.
Right. And you sort of glossed over it, but I think an interesting thing for people to realize, especially in the AAA, these big teams, is you said these automatic tests runs. You can have either a daily build or a pull request. And there's builds that either go on a scheduled basis or at a point of integration at a milestone or daily, which is a way to do it. And then there's automated tests, right? So why don't you explain that for people that don't understand that?
Yeah, it differs by product, by game substantially. And from my work in high tech, when I was doing technical writing, like writing manuals and documentation, it was much the same there, where there are usually a slate of automated tests that are run usually by either, I think, just running the program, running some basic routines. In games, it's a little bit more complicated because you can't necessarily run a test that will say, okay, I want to pretend that I'm a player and run into every wall in the game. That's a very difficult thing to program a test to do. But what you can do is you can check over all the lights in the game and make sure that they've rendered correctly, or that their properties are set correctly. You can check over the nav mesh, the area that you are allowed to walk in a 3D game is a good way to put it for the nav mesh. You can make sure that there are no substantial gaps or anything that you can detect in the nav mesh that have been created by people changing level geometry, moving things around. Because often the nav mesh is automatically generated because to do it by hand would be incredibly fiddly, especially on a very large product.
Right.
So there are automated tests at that level. And then also at the lower levels, did it build correctly? Were there other errors? Was everything kind of implemented correctly and placed correctly? That's especially often used for graphics and audio. Yeah. To make sure that files are there, the proper format, the proper size, is a good constant way to constantly check that no one has accidentally changed anything behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Right? Or no one has checked in their work halfway through fixing something. And then that gets into a nightly build. And then next day, the build is freaking out because something very strange has happened because a half finished feature is suddenly acting up.
One of my big projects, we had a light, and the light could change colors, and it could be green or it could be red. And you'd come in the morning after the nightly build, and if the light was red, that means somebody broke the build.
Yeah.
And the build is only done. That's not just, I mean, if it doesn't even compile, that's step one. but it's running all of the tests. It's running all of the automated tests, the integration tests, because my code might compile, your code might compile, it might look great. Even my personal unit testing, and then on a small team, the developers do some of their own testing. I'm sure. But when we put it together, my code might break your code, and then now the game doesn't save anymore. So we're checking if the game saves and loads. But yeah, if that light is red, then you got a bad day, because everybody gets in the war room and you figure out what's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
Somebody
I remember
broke
lots of whiteboards. There were always lots of whiteboards, lots of things at the companies that I worked at. Whenever we would go down and talk to the coders or try to learn about new features that were coming along, there was a lot of signage to keep track of what was going in and what was going out and what was working and what wasn't.
Did you ever run into experiences where you saw a bug or something like you've just described has been fixed, and then like several iterations later, it reappears?
Absolutely. That happens quite frequently because there's two reasons, probably. One is that generally development is done with source control, so people are kind of checking out parts of the code and then checking it back in, and it's maintaining a version history, so if something goes wrong, you can always roll back to an earlier version. If someone didn't realize that they hadn't checked in, they might be working on an older code base, and then later they check those files in and undo some work that's been done since. And then the other way that sometimes happens is just ghosts in the machine, I like to call it, which is that game engines aren't perfect. Many of them are quite flawed. They're sort of the best tool available for the job. But a good example is Unity, very commonly used indie game engine, has a bit of a problem with floating point numbers, so big decimals, essentially, decimals with lots of decimal places. The longer it gets, the more likely they are to round incorrectly. And so when you're dealing with a lot of floating point numbers, floats, sometimes you get differences between one build and the next that maybe shouldn't have been there. You get minor variations that can kind of cascade. And so usually if something shows back up again later, that's a sign that you may have fixed a symptom rather than a problem. Mm-hmm. Or simply that someone didn't check their code in.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Or the branching and the merging and the remerging something back in that was on another branch. When it got remerged back in, it overwrote something back to what it was. What kind of tools do you use? So small and big. So the small, I would imagine it's much less tools dependent, test tools. But tell us about some of the tools that you use? Everything. So as you said, whiteboards to
yeah. No, my major day-to-day tools are pretty simple because of the kind of testing that we're doing on a smaller scale. The main tool that I use really is just sort of keeping meticulous notes of what I see. And the most important tool I use day-to-day is OBS, the open broadcasting software, which is what many people use to stream, but it can also record locally in great lossless quality.
That's quite a tip right there.
It can also be hooked up to have controller display overlays or keyboard and mouse display so you can see inputs. You can have it show volume levels. You can have it show a lot of stuff on the video recording itself if you set it up properly. So there's lots of ways I could record footage of the game, but OBS lets me set up my kind of little command station of everything that shows what I'm inputting and what the game is doing and the game feed. And then I record everything I do. Everything I try, I spend time recording. And then when I run into a bug, I just note down the timestamp. And then at the end of the day or at the end of my recording, I review, go back, find the footage, cut it up, clip it, and post it up on our bug tracking software for the developer to see.
Yeah.
And I don't use a lot of other testing software or anything like that. There is a little bit more testing software used, I believe, on the console side especially. But being remote, I don't actually have access to developer kits and kind of console testing, so I'm mainly on the PC side.
Consoles, platforms, phones, mobile, they all have both just testing to make sure everything works, just running it and testing it in all the games. Same sort of gameplay testing, repeating all of that on those platforms is one thing that happens. But then I know there are different sort of development guidelines and regulations for how the software needs to run on those platforms. So there might be a test suite specific to those platforms that has to run to make those work.
And there's both test suites and there's also manual tests, like is simply ensuring that buttons work as they're intended to, that the home button in the middle of the controller always works under any circumstances. On a console, that's very important. There are a million other specific things that they request that they want you to test for as part of certification, which is just ensuring that your game won't break someone's Xbox or PlayStation or Switch. But also that it is, to a certain degree, it's suitable for the platform. It actually runs at a frame rate that's reasonable, and it doesn't break. Testing for achievements is another important thing that happens on console, and is one of the more laborious parts of the process, maybe for us. Because sometimes it just means playing the game 29 times.
Have you killed this boss 29 times? Oh boy.
Wait a minute, testing for achievements. So does that mean that the software has to be looking at everything you do to see if you just completed an achievement?
Pretty much. Well, in games, there will be some kind of hookup for achievements that will just say, like, when you've done X, you'll add a bit of code that says, when you've done X, tell Steam that this is unlocking this achievement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But we have to make sure those achievements unlock. We have to make sure that they fire when they're intended to, especially if they're doubly so if they're tracked in game as well.
Yeah.
Because there might be a disparity between what correctly fires in game and what fires in the system around the game, Steam or a console platform.
Yeah, there definitely can be. Yeah.
And if you get an achievement to fire in-game and not on the platform, that might mean that, for example, the game no longer checks. So you can never get that achievement again. And that might not be a thing that concerns every player, but a lot of players do care about achievements. Oh, yeah. Console platforms.
And they might not care that much about achievements unless they don't get the one that then they care.
Yeah.
And by they, I mean me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, those are like menus and like early game things, like early gameplay. Those are things that people are going to run headlong into very quickly. Even rare achievements, people are likely to try to chase them down as soon as they can. There's lots of people who are, achievement hunters or just kind of power players who are just looking to do stuff like that. And we want to account for them as well as the players who are going to take 2 months to finish the game.
Right.
And ensure that everybody will get what they expect when it should arrive. Or at least that we've done our level best to ensure that it will, because we can't guarantee everything and things always change. But especially on our small scale, what we can do is just be as rigorous as we can with the time that we have.
That idea of going back and testing everything that was tested before and should still be working, the term I used to use for that is probably still the same term as regression testing. So
absolutely.
You're testing to make sure that everything that okay, I already tested this stuff. I tested all this stuff last week, but we made some changes. We added some code. We did a new build, and now we've got to do regression testing. So we think about things like beta. There's just a build goes on the PTS, and there a couple bugs are found, and now why can't they just release a build tomorrow? Because all of these regression tests need to happen.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, so I don't know, some of these game studios seem to do it relatively quickly. So maybe it's a ton of it is automated, but I could see, and in some of the project schedules that I worked on before, is once we started to get towards, beta and release, trying to go gold, if a major bug needed to be fixed, it was a week that the project automatically got extended by a week. Because you needed to go through all of the regression testing, all of the integration testing again. And then, when you're certifying on all of these platforms and going through all of that and the multiple languages and language translation, and it's a huge, huge amount of work.
It is.
So I can't imagine that.
All those builds take time as well. Like building a game for particular platforms is a specialist task in itself. Like if we work with a studio to help port it, or we have a specialist who we work with directly, they might have to spend a day putting a build together that we can then test before we could even think about submitting that to the console platform.
Right.
And that's also true of every major patch. And on a smaller scale, we don't do as much structured regression testing. But since we're constantly sort of iterating and cycling through the game and through different things, we tend to do regression testing for the most severe cases and the most severe issues that have come up. Because our general process is we find a bug or we find an issue or something else comes up, we report it. It seemingly gets resolved by the developers. We may have to wait for that new build in which the fix arrives, and then we get in and test it. And if it's not fixed, we send it back. And if it is fixed, then we earmark it. We say this is done as of this version. And if it's severe enough, we're definitely going to check it again later, especially before major releases go. Because as we mentioned, sometimes things come back. Sometimes there's no good reason why things come back, and they do. Like, as I said, sometimes it's a symptom rather than the actual problem.
It's cosmic rays. Just
yeah, exactly.
Resolved as cosmic rays.
Yeah, exactly. And to a certain degree, like, we can only catch so much of that stuff. There's only so many hours in the day, and being a small team, we're limited in our scope, even though the project is also smaller than, like, say, a giant AAA project.
Right.
So while our methods tend to be a little bit more ad hoc, we generally do the same things. And regression testing is an important part because it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's sort of shaking off those assumptions about what is and isn't fixed and what players may or may not find or run into.
Yeah.
And regression testing is a good reminder to kind of come at it from first principles again and not assume that something is totally resolved, because it might not be, and more often than not, it is fixed. But every now and then, mysterious things happen.
Yeah. Now there's a category of tests, and I learned a new term when I was doing some research relatively recently. The things like performance testing and stress testing and load testing, and the new term I learned was soak testing, where you're just running the game and just letting it run for 100 hours or 500 hours, or just let it sit there on the menu all week and make sure that you don't have any memory leaks or weird things that you didn't expect. And so describe some of that. I know you've done some work there too.
Yeah. We do, to a certain degree, in terms of performance testing, we will test it on as many different machines as we can of different specs. And we sort of have a variety of them available. And so my sort of personal machine that I use at home is also just my regular computer, but it is decently powerful, but it's not the most powerful. It's not a fancy gaming PC. So it's actually a pretty good benchmark for, say, like medium settings on a modern game. But as you mentioned, memory leaks are a common issue in modern engines. Even if the game itself is very well coded, a lot of modern engines are you're kind of leaving a lot of things up to the engine: garbage collection, dealing with data, kind of saving and loading data and how that can pile up, or loading of images into memory can slowly pile up, especially on a weaker platform just in terms of performance power.
Yeah.
Like CPU power or graphics card power. So we do a bit of soak testing in that we are kind of very consistently running things for long periods of time. And a lot of our testing, I'd say, I usually call it rigor testing. And it's sort of a bit of a mix of all those things. It's kind of stress testing. What happens if, I kind of mentioned pressing every button at once, but what happens if you just go back and forth between the two most performance heavy areas of the game over and over and over again?
Yeah.
What happens if you just keep scrolling through a kind of endless scroll menu? Or what happens if you just do the same action on an endless loop for quite a while? And that is actually probably the most often, that is probably the most frequent place that I see things start to break down, because those are things that you kind of can't account for as a developer. Like, you don't know that someone leaving their game open for 40 hours might start to cause problems. But many games don't get closed these days. On PC, people are more likely to close games, but on console, they often just go to sleep. They're just in the background. And they're not necessarily running, but the game never actually gets closed.
Right.
So
okay,
ensuring that things will remain stable.
That's kind of way
yeah,
that
mobile
works.
especially.
Yeah.
Because when you're dealing with a limited scope platform like that, in that we know what the specs of the device are, but we don't know necessarily how it's going to handle the particular things that this game is throwing at it as opposed to another game. That's sort of, it's beneficial in one way. We have one singular target to hit. It's not like we don't get all sorts of different people coming to us saying, hey, this doesn't run on my complex Linux build I put together, or this doesn't run on my computer from 20 years ago. Hitting a console target doesn't seem like it should be that hard, but it's a unique piece of hardware. There's usually nothing else quite like it. So ensuring that everything runs smoothly, especially for long periods of time, if the game is left open, if the game goes to sleep, if the game is doing a lot of saving and loading, especially of images and textures, because those are probably these days, that and uncompressed audio is probably the most substantial contribution to file size of games these days, I would say.
Got it.
Because these days where like games are just shipping with textures that are a minimum of like 4,000 by 4,000 very often. Like there's just a large image, you know, and if you have enough of those constantly being loaded in and out of memory, sooner or later you might start to hit the limitations of a particular device.
Yeah. And as you said, the garbage collection and understanding when you're allowing objects and textures to be unloaded. If I exit an area, but I might go back to that area, depending on even some of the architecture, this is a design on a mobile device that could make a big difference.
Absolutely.
In performance and how many of those 4K maps, texture maps you've got loaded up. It's crazy, I'm sure.
Yeah. And there's so much performance to be gained by improving those things. And sort of the inverse, I guess, of that in QA is we're looking for low performance areas of the game, things that might need optimization or things that could be optimized. And we're also, often we're doing our best to diagnose it. We can't necessarily see the code base. We don't necessarily see what they're doing on the back end that is causing the game to slow down to this degree. But we can say, okay, it's slowing down in these situations. It's slowing down when it is loading a lot of images. It's slowing down when it's loading 3D geometry or loading into a new area. Or it's just slowing down when it's been running for a while. Or it just makes your phone really hot because it's running it a little too hard.
And you also know that maybe it's slowing down now and it wasn't in a previous build.
Yeah. And that again is a thing we just have to keep out for. A thing we just have to keep an eye out for is a part of our regression testing is just looking at everything again, over and over with a fresh set of eyes, trying to think of it as sort of the through line through all this that I keep saying is, what's it going to look like for the player on day 1? Or on the player on day 300 who's been told that this is a great thing that they're really going to enjoy, and then they get it, and maybe it doesn't meet their expectations, or maybe there are issues with it that we could have fixed day 1 or before. So we're trying to account for them too.
to sort of bring it to something that we are all much more familiar with, that Seema, you suggested, there's a couple axioms that I love to think about, which is no plan survives first contact with the enemy. and the enemy in this case is the player. If you're a DM, if you're in Dungeons and Dragons, you understand that implicitly. And everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. That's a Mike Tyson. So early access, beta testing, getting it in front of players, and seeing it break, getting us, Seema and I, getting our hands on something. What is that? What is that like for you in terms of a tester and the development team? And I mean, it's got to be terrifying.
Okay, it's very spooky. It's very strange because it's not quite release. And release is incredibly complex feeling. I don't even know how to articulate what it is to put something out there and then just sit and watch and hope it doesn't break. I hope that you didn't miss anything, knowing that you probably did. Hopefully it won't be too substantial. But beta testing is really interesting because probably the best way to put it is that beta testers are fantastic at rigor testing because there might be a decent amount of them. They all play in different ways. They experiment. They're more inclined to experiment. They're also more engaged and maybe a little more forgiving of bugs and issues and a little more willing to report them than your average player who just happened to buy the game in a sale or something.
Right.
So they're there and they're engaged and they're supportive of the process from the jump. So they are very good at finding surface level issues, and they're very good at finding kind of issues deep into parts of the game that people might not see for a long time, that you might miss. Because the later parts of the game maybe they got more general testing, but they didn't get as much kind of play testing because there wasn't as much time just spent endlessly iterating on them. Beta testers are great at spotting things like typos and little visual issues and things like that, which are important. I definitely don't want to make those seem unimportant because we're also looking out for those as well. And them catching them means that we don't have to. But also, every part of the game, I feel like, contributes to the player's first experience of it. And we want to have the best possible experience for them. So little visual issues, some people are okay with that. And I don't think anybody's going to close the game in disgust if there's a little bit of rendering issue or something. But it doesn't kind of put our best foot forward. So beta testers help a lot with that.
Right.
Making sure we have a good baseline level of stability, and then QA can really dig into the weirder and stranger paths through the game.
Yeah. Now you just mentioned understanding that as you release, there might be bugs in the game, and there might be bugs that you know about. How many bugs? I mean, so this is something we dealt with, and probably much greater in like enterprise software for a business. If I've got like 10 people in an accounting department that are going to be using this thing, I don't care. There might be, there might be, hundreds of bugs, but if they're rarely ever going to hit it, and it's just these 10 people, it doesn't matter.
You can train them around to deal with them.
Yeah.
But the more complex the project, the bigger the like these games that are being produced, they're, at the peak of the bug list at the peak could be what, like thousands, tens of thousands of bugs.
Absolutely.
And then there's a concept which I love when I was in project management, which is the rate we're discovering bugs versus the rate we're fixing bugs. And if we're fixing bugs faster than we're discovering them, that's good. That's goodness. And the point at which we're fixing them faster than they're being created and discovered, and those lines that the chart of discovered and fixed crosses, that's bug convergence. And then again, you're asking the tester if it's done. Then you're getting to something that might be able to be released someday.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, describe that. Describe, like, I mean, everything releases, there's bugs in everything, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that's
the witness,
definitely a thing I try to I think an idea I try to get across to friends of mine, to anybody who's sort of interested in games and game development or just plays games, is not only that games will ship with bugs, games have to ship with bugs because there's a limited amount of time in the day. It's very hard to make a perfect game. Very, very, very hard. Some people have done it. Most people aren't going to. And the larger your team is, the more you've got going on, the less likely it is that everything is going to be absolutely perfect beginning to end. It's an unreasonable expectation. What is a reasonable expectation is that it won't be super buggy. The bugs won't, if there are any, they won't infringe on your experience. But, you know, our bugs are closer to maybe the count of like a couple thousand than like tens of thousands over the course of a project. But a lot of them also build on each other, or we will kind of go back and look over them over and over again. Because on a bigger project, very often they will structure things as like every bug is a new bug, even if it's a recurring thing. Because regression, it's kind of a new issue. Other parts of the program have changed. You don't know how this thing might be affected by one of the recent changes that have been made, whatever. But yeah, in the industry, it's called, I believe, known shippable. Is a flag that you would put on a bug to say, look, we know this is here. It is not destructive enough or problematic enough or likely for someone to run into it that it's going to prevent us from shipping, because we can fix it and we intend to fix it, but it is not our highest priority.
Yeah.
And we do not foresee it being our highest priority before launch. And we are going to try to fix as many as we possibly can, but as always, they're being triaged, they're being prioritized very aggressively, because we have to think about what things are the biggest risk to the most players, or to console certification, or to like performance areas that are much more front-facing than kind of back-facing parts of the game that people won't get to for a while. Those sometimes are held back a bit in terms of priority, because you're just more likely to get a patch out before most people get to them.
Yeah.
Which sounds a little cavalier, but there are going to be bugs, unavoidably. So it's sort of we ask for everybody's patience in that regard. But we also understand that, like, we can't publish a list of known issues with the game when we put the game out there, really. Maybe if you're doing open development or beta testing, but we could do that, but most people won't read it. Having worked in writing manuals and stuff like that, people don't read things. And that's understandable.
I was elected to lead, not to read.
Yeah, exactly. And so we can put that info out there, and we do. We write change logs, and we put that info out there as much as we can for the people who are going to bother to read it. But most players aren't. Many players won't even know that we've done it. So we have to account for them as well. So that's why we kind of prioritize so aggressively and specifically. And another little axiom of QA is that if you find a bug in a game, it doesn't necessarily mean the testing wasn't good.
Right.
It means that the bug didn't get fixed for various reasons. It could be because it wasn't prioritized. It could be because of mismanagement. It could be because of a multitude of different reasons. But QA probably knows about that bug. A lot of people kind of like to, maybe jokingly, maybe not, blame QA for the existence of bugs in a game. But mostly you should blame QA for the non-existence of bugs in a game, because it means they found them. And I don't blame the programmers for introducing bugs, because it's just an inevitability, really. Software is buggy. People aren't perfect. Code isn't perfect.
Right.
So all that adds up, and we just sort of we beg your patience while we fix these things as swiftly as we can.
Yeah, and perfection costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time. If we're going to put a rocket into space, then we'll spend the $1 billion that it takes to do that. If you ever want to play a game again, though, play a video game, don't ask for perfection, because nobody's going to spend $1 billion to make your video game. But I get it. We're still gonna we can't have showstoppers, and that's so there's triage and there's prioritization and showstoppers, and we can, as consumers of these games, expect that we aren't going to have the showstoppers, or if we do, if we run into that it gets fixed pretty quick, because things don't stop when things get released anymore these days, do they?
No, we continue supporting the games for quite a while afterwards. Most immediately, like after Tunic released, one of the first things I did was I watched a lot of streamers play Tunic, because streamers are a very unique kind of player, in that they play in a sort of interesting haphazard way because they're constantly being distracted. Their attention is constantly split. So they have a tendency to play in unique ways. They wait in places you wouldn't normally wait. They pause in places you wouldn't normally pause. They do things that you wouldn't normally think to do. And that makes them actually super valuable as sort of like post-release testing footage, because they might run into things that no one else would. The downside of that, of course, is that they do that in front of an audience who may or may not be so charitable. And one thing I definitely want to add is that the people running into those bugs, I don't want to downplay, even as I say, please take it easy on QA a little bit. I don't want to downplay the concerns that they have and the severity of some of those issues and how frustrating it can be for you to anticipate something or buy something and just not have it work. I absolutely understand the problems with that. But it's important to know that it's never going to be perfect, and we will try our level best. And also, we appreciate people reporting bugs. It's incredibly helpful when people report bugs, especially if they add video, even a screenshot, just a decent description, anything will do. Because chances are we might know about it, we might not know about it, but we can start collating data from different people or from...
Any more information is helpful. My game crashed.
Exactly.
Okay, that's mildly interesting, and I'm concerned. What happened? Well, my house got struck by lightning. Okay, well that's different than I was loading a complex area of the game. I need to know these things. And the more we know, the better. That sounds excellent.
And even audience members. Oh, sorry.
No,
sorry.
Go ahead, because I was going to transition us out. We've gone much deeper into this stuff, which I love,
which is fantastic. I love it too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. The last thing I was going to say, maybe on that topic, a good way to close it out is even the audience members who get angry at us do so generally because they're excited about the game. Yeah. I would really rather they not get angry at us, especially when it's quite literally not our fault. But I don't want them to be hard on the developers. I don't want them to be hard on QA. I don't want them to be hard on the company or the social media manager who has zero control over any of that on the Twitter account. But they're reacting in that way because they have run into a legitimate issue. Their assessment of the issue might not be correct. Their assessment of the severity of the issue or how much it impedes them from actually playing the game may not be correct, but they have a legit concern. And so that's why we appreciate it when they bring it to us, even if they're a little grumpy about it. But we still would rather they not be actually angry about it, because there's not a lot we can do with that.
Or
as feedback.
Or be angry, but don't be mean.
Exactly.
I mean, When we've talked about that, we've talked about similar things and this is a theme that sort of runs across a lot of the developers that we've been talking to. It's tough. It's tough to sort of be in that line of fire, and it's these broad groups of players and lots of different kinds of players, and it's the most vocal few that can feel problematic to a developer. And you could say, well, they deserve it. They put themselves out there, and we're paying money, but no one deserves to be attacked personally. And so we've come back to that time and again.
Yeah.
One thing that I know you've come back to, and you have some great thoughts on that, I think we can sort of wrap up in our last 5-10 minutes here, is community. So the community that you've sort of created as a game developer, communities between game developers and communities of players. We have some experience with that. Seema and I help run a very large gaming community. We're in the middle of a really cool gaming community week of our own this week with Alea Iacta Est, our guild that's been around for 12, 13,
Yeah.
14 years now.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on community and community building and trying to find those players who are positive and or do match your play style? Talk to me about that, and then we'll talk about developers and how they form communities too.
Yeah. Community building is, to me, like, community building is this sort of complex, amorphous thing. But an area, I think, where QA can be quite valuable, because our entire job is to sympathize with the audience or empathize with the audience. Our entire job is to try to anticipate issues they might run into, concerns they might have, and head them off as best we can. And I'm not Finji's community manager, but I'm actually a moderator in Finji's Discord. And I was before a volunteer moderator before I actually started working with Finji, because I had gotten to know them through game dev in general. And we do our level best to build a positive community and a supportive community and a community where people share information. Like for Tunic, especially, a game with many mysteries and sort of questions, we have tried to foster a community based around hinting and not giving things away wholesale, and trying to kind of lead and encourage as best we can, and build a community where people will keep coming back because they feel comfortable. And the comfortable is the most important part. To me, it's not even necessarily about like safe spaces, but spaces where the presence of moderators or people in charge is felt, where they're present and they don't feel like they're just sort of throwing edicts down from on high. They're part of the community as well. And they're listening to people's concerns and being as straightforward and helpful as they can to a point. And the point beyond that, in terms of maintaining a safe community for gamers or game devs, game players, or a community around a game, is that there has to be an upper limit in terms of what people are willing to tolerate in the community.
Yeah.
And that's an area that I've spoken about in the game dev community, is sustainability. A community, to be sustainable, has to have people in charge who are willing to contribute to that sustainability and keep things going, and are also willing to make decisions to further that sustainability and open it to more people.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means removing elements of the community that are hostile, or just setting a better example, or, as we sometimes put it, as other moderators I've seen put it, key jangling, which is sometimes you just have to go in there and say, okay, we're going to talk about something else now. We're not going to talk about this here.
Yep. Changing that topic.
Yeah, exactly. It's being present and being clear and straightforward as much as possible to set the standard for a community, and to let people know that this is a place where they can hang out comfortably. Because a lot of online communities aren't necessarily hostile, but they're also not necessarily welcoming.
Or they're just too random to even know.
There's
what
no
you're going to
perceivable
necessarily
limits. Yeah.
You might not. You may not be able to find them in the first place, or they might be highly technical. You might arrive in a community to find everybody talking about things in a way that you don't understand yet because you haven't been part of the community. And it's good to have folks both higher up in the community, whether it's moderators or owners of the community or whatever, as well as people, just members of the community in general, who are willing to chat with new folks and bring them up to speed and give them advice and not expect them to know everything right from the jump. Because that's a very kind of common thing, especially in online communities these days, is people tend to kind of like, maybe it's just a light poking fun or something, but people tend to sort of like jump on and react to kind of mistakes or people saying things like incorrect things, because they just don't know. They're just trying to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And so being welcoming, being supportive, and being kind of firm and straightforward when you have to be,
direct,
contributes a lot to that.
The coaching. I think you hit on a couple of really important topics there. One is being mindful about the culture you're trying to build in the community. And you can have a really aggressive PvP, trash talk culture, and build that up how you want it. That's okay. Being mindful that that's what you're creating, and then coaching the environment around that. If you want it to be the kind of community where new people can come in and be welcomed and be helped out, and you said the hints rather than just giving answers or saying go look it up, setting that culture. If the moderators and the leaders that are, and the influencers, even the organic influencers of the community, set that culture and tone, it becomes intrinsic. So it's no longer something that has to be an extrinsic rule or it's something that has to be imposed, but it's just intrinsic to the community then. And then it tends to work really well.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be intrinsic, but I think you have to always be on top of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Like it's, and I say this is love. It's like training a dog, right? Like a dog, you need to be paying attention to your dog all the time. It's like that. You can't,
you need to regression test your community as well. Kind of, because each time you add a new person to the community, that person, it hasn't been there. They don't know the culture yet necessarily. And you can sort of like tell them, or you can have a little welcome message, but it could change the dynamic. So doing a little bit of regression testing, continuing to keep things on track. And I as a leader, as a moderator, I think is good. You had a couple good ideas though on building a new community, starting that up. And one of the phrases that you've said before is just to keep showing up, be present, be there. So describe that. I think that's a really good concept.
Yeah, I can't remember the source of it. I believe it was years ago from a game jam keynote speech. Some game jams events where folks get together game developers get together to bash out a little game project in a short time, just a way to kind of get the creative juices flowing. Jams are super popular, and some of the bigger ones have little keynotes. They'll have people do talks. They'll have little things to kind of help people along in their creative process. And one of them just instilled this one phrase in my head years ago, and that was keep showing up. And that's sort of gone through everything that I've done since: my work, my personal projects, the communities that I've helped build, the communities that I'm part of, is that someone has to be there to turn the lights on at the beginning of the day, so to speak. Someone has to be there to turn them off at the end of the day. And if a community doesn't exist, you can build one. It's a lot of work, whether that's a game dev community or a gamer community. It's a lot of work to build one, but one way that you can build one passively is just by continuing to show up, establishing sort of a spot or a place or a tone, and continuing to maintain that and continuing to keep things rolling.
Yeah.
And communities, like as we mentioned before, a good point to recognize that that you've set a good tone in a community is if random members of the community start helping to enforce the rules of the community. And they don't have any power to do so, but they feel empowered to say, maybe you should tone it down a little or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
right.
And they feel comfortable saying that. And often that comes across better for some elements of the community or folks who maybe just arrived and don't know the tone yet than it would if a moderator comes down on them. They might just leave, kind of understandably, because it feels a little heavy-handed.
Right.
And in game dev communities, it's kind of the same. It's you keep showing up and you keep welcoming people. You keep being there and being supportive, being helpful. And that's also kind of how you get known in communities. That's how you establish yourself in communities, is you make something, you create a guild, you create something that persists long enough that people begin to recognize you for it. And it's not because you want to be recognized for it, but it's because you're looking to foster something. And the best way to do that is to just keep asserting that it should exist until it does.
Yeah, will it into existence and keep showing up and make it a reality. I like that. All right, well, I like that we got that in. We went much deeper into QA and all the different kinds of QA. I had a lot of fun with that conversation.
That's what I was hoping for. So thank you for that.
Been a while since I was deep into QA, as I said. We didn't even get into like the usability testing where I had people Like I was behind a pane of glass. We had to watch somebody do a thing and like note down what they're doing and what are they doing? I don't, ask those
They
kinds
aren't
of questions.
supposed to do that.
Yeah, watching streamers, I think, is the closest thing I have to that.
Yeah,
where I
you
go,
could kind of get
why
that.
are you doing that? Like, how did you fall out of the world there? Why are you mashing that button? How did you find a frame perfect bug that locks the game? I didn't find that. Yeah, it's always streamers. I don't know why.
So this has been great, and this is exactly the kind of thing that we hope for. So this is a great role we haven't talked to yet. Really appreciate your time and sort of teaching us what it's like in small and big organizations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonah.
No problem at all. I'm always happy. I love to demystify these things. I love to talk about them because a lot of people just don't know. And just knowing a little bit more about the people behind the games who make these games gives it a bit more of a human side, and people respond better in general. Communities respond better, and people respond better when there are bugs.
Yep.
They know there's someone they can send them to who will probably get them fixed. So that's a pretty good feeling as someone playing a game, knowing that even if you run into something, there's someone out there who's going to fix it.
All right. Absolutely. Again, thank you very much. And we will talk again soon, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
This has been a New Overlords production. For more, please visit newoverlords.com for video, subscribe and feed links, and other ways to help the show.